For more than a century, one of the biggest questions in all of science has been this: the Cambrian Explosion. Seriously, how did life on Earth go from being incredibly simple for billions of years to suddenly erupting into all the complex forms we know? Well, today we're diving into a fascinating new and testable idea. It suggests we shouldn't think of this as a slow biological process, but as something much more sudden, a rapid, system-wide phase transition.
So here's our game plan. First, we'll really dig into what makes the Cambrian explosion such a huge mystery. Then, we'll introduce this new hypothesis. After that, we'll break down its key ideas, figure out how you could actually test it, and finally, talk about why this new way of thinking is so important for how we see evolution.
All right, first things first, let's talk about evolution's biggest mystery. We've got to go way back in time to really get a feel for this sudden, absolutely dramatic leap that life took.
So what was the Cambrian explosion, really? Even Charles Darwin himself called it an inexplicable mystery. And he had a good reason. It's this one moment in history that just seems to fly in the face of the slow, gradual evolution he was thinking about. Just look at this timeline to understand how wild this is. For almost 3 billion years, life on our planet was basically just microscopic stuff. Then, around 600 million years ago, we start seeing some simple, soft-bodied creatures. But then, starting 541 million years ago, everything changes. And I mean in a geological blink of an eye.
It's like the fossil record just goes wild. All of a sudden, you've got animals with shells, with exoskeletons, with legs, even complex eyes. The ancestors of pretty much every animal group we see today, from insects to us, they just show up. It seems like they came out of nowhere. And that is the puzzle. Why so much complexity so ridiculously fast?
So how do we even begin to solve a puzzle like that? Well, there's a new idea on the table called the phase transition theory, and it suggests that maybe, just maybe, we've been looking at the problem from the wrong angle.
Here's the core idea. Put simply, the whole ecosystem before the Cambrian period was building up something called structural pressure. And when that pressure finally hit a critical breaking point, the entire system was forced to reorganize, fast, into a totally new and much more complex state. It wasn't a slow burn. It was like a system-wide crash and reboot.
And we should give credit where it's due. This whole framework comes from the work of researcher, inventor, and author Kevin L. Brown.
Okay, so let's unpack those two big ideas: structural pressure and structural reorganization. What are we actually talking about here?
Let's start with structural pressure. This isn't just one thing. It's all the forces building up at once. Things like more oxygen in the air, more minerals in the water to build shells and skeletons, and all these new genetic tools just waiting to be used. The best way to think about it is like a dam holding back a massive lake. The pressure is building and building, even if the surface of the water looks calm.
And once that pressure gets to be too much, you get structural reorganization. This isn't a slow, gentle change. It's a sudden flip into a totally new state. A perfect analogy is thinking about liquid water. It's pretty disorganized, right? But the second it hits that critical point, 0 degrees Celsius, it snaps into the highly organized, complex structure of ice. That sudden change, that's a phase transition. So this model basically lays out two phases. You have the base phase, that was the stable, quiet world of the Ediacaran period, with simple, soft creatures. But then, the system hits the transition phase. The environment gets saturated with all that oxygen and all those minerals, and the structural pressure builds and builds right up to its breaking point. It's setting the stage for an explosion.
Now, that is a really compelling story. But in science, a good story is never enough. The real question is, can we actually test this idea?
So how would you go about it? Well, first, scientists could use all the geological and fossil data we have to try and model this buildup of structural pressure over millions of years. Then comes the tricky part. They'd need to pinpoint the exact critical threshold, that point of no return. And the final piece of the puzzle, the real smoking gun, would be to show that the Cambrian explosion kicked off right after that threshold was crossed.
And here's what makes this a real scientific theory. You can prove it wrong. It's falsifiable, and that's the mark of good science. So the theory gets a big check mark if we find a clear link between a peak in that pressure and the start of the explosion. But what if we find evidence of a time when pressure was incredibly high, yet nothing happened? If there was no explosion, then the hypothesis is false. It's as simple as that.
So let's bring it all home. Why does this even matter? Well, this isn't just about some ancient fossils.
It actually offers a completely new way to think about how evolution itself might work.
Okay, so here are the big things to remember. First, this idea reframes the Cambrian explosion not as a slow crawl, but as a sudden phase transition, like water freezing into ice. Second, it gets us to think about the entire planet's ecosystem as one single interconnected system. Third, and this is so important, it gives us a real scientific framework we can actually go out and test. And finally, it suggests that evolution isn't always slow and steady. Sometimes when the conditions are just right, it takes huge revolutionary leaps.
And that really leaves us with one last big question to think about. Is the story of life on Earth a slow, steady climb up a mountain, or is it more like a series of sudden, powerful leaps from one stable plateau to the next? This new hypothesis suggests it might just be the latter, and that could completely change how we think about the engine of creativity in life itself.